Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lunch and Lead. We're glad you could join us today. Today, my partner and I, Courtney Kristen, are going to talk about conflict management. My name is Tirza Watts, and I'm the Director of Student Life and Campus Community. Courtney, what would you like to share about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Kristen. I'm the coordinator for student organizations. I'm also in my master's program in the Higher Education and Student Affairs counseling track.
Excellent. Thank you. So one of the reasons we want to talk about conflict management is that this is a skill that leaders absolutely need to learn. In fact, when we have studied leadership nationally and leadership of college students, the two lowest areas of comfort for college student leaders is the area of change and creating change, and the second one is conflict management. So this is a really important topic for you to learn. So today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the roots of conflict, 6 ways that you can deal with conflict. I'm going to talk with Courtney about what her conflict management style is, and you will have an opportunity to pause the video and actually take an inventory. We're going to talk about some recommendations for you when it comes to managing conflict, and we're also going to talk about something called I language, and that's a way to actually address conflict. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you set up having a crucial conversation with somebody where you know some conflict might be part of that discussion. So I want to start with asking you a question, Courtney. So if you would brainstorm for us, what are some things that are good about conflict? What can it bring about positively?
I think it can bring about change if something needs to be changed, and a conflict is what brings about the conversation. I think that can be positive.
Okay, one of the things I know that always comes to mind for me, sometimes when there's conflict about an idea, it's about the idea. It's not necessarily about the people in the meeting. And so sometimes conflict can actually end up generating creative ideas.
Oh, yes.
Conflict is a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, my second question is, what do you think is bad about conflict?
Sometimes it can feel personal, or it can be made to be personal, and then it can be an uncomfortable situation for sure, and maybe like push people apart as opposed to closer together.
Right. Students, we'd like for you actually to pause the video and get a paper and pen, because if you would like credit for this workshop, these are 2 of the questions we're going to ask you to respond to in our after video attendance credit worksheet. So we'd like you to take some notes on what you think is good about conflict and what is bad about conflict. So Courtney, let me talk to you a little bit about the development of conflict. So for those of us that have had roommates, if we grew up with siblings, some of this may actually sound familiar. You know, conflict starts with people have a disagreement. And sometimes both parties believe they're right, and the other person, you're just wrong, right? It's not a threat or really angsty at this point. It's just, yeah, you're wrong, I'm right. But then if we don't do anything about talking about whatever that difference is, sometimes the sense of I'm right intensifies. The longer it lasts, you get even more I'm right, you're wrong, right? At this point, people cease to listen to each other with any degree of understanding. Sometimes they completely stop listening. I know that when I worked in a residence hall and was in charge of about 350 students, I literally remember a student coming to tell me that she and her roommate argued and managed conflicts by putting Post-it notes on each other's computers. And they literally would do it when the other person was out of the room, right? And so now that has morphed into people just texting each other. Maybe they say something snarky about a conflict on social media. They just stop listening. And then what happens? Anything that you feel negative about that person, even if it was something that didn't bother you a lot, now everything bothers you, right? Perceptions of negativity, they blow up. Now you don't like them at all, everything about them. And then if the other person realizes this is completely out of hand, you know, they may try to say, hey, let's sit down and talk. And now you're like, nope, not having it. Gestures toward reconciliation. You think that person's being deceitful or manipulative. You don't trust that they really want to solve the problem because it's just gone on way too long. And so just as our graphic shows on the screen, it's a volcano, it blows up. So relationship explosion. And so I know sometimes little tiny things have resulted in like roommates no longer living together. People in relationships breaking up, totally mentally checking out of an academic project because you wanted to type the paper versus somebody else. And so those relationships just fall apart.
Here's what I feel like you have like a glimpse into my relationships with that. Like you like read me for exactly what has happened. It's so interesting how it can be like so individualized, but the structure and what's going on in the conflict is the same, like across the board.
Yeah, I think I've learned over my lifetime, the hot second I realize something's not going well and there's a conflict there, I should probably go ahead and call the elephant in the room an elephant. And, you know, share that I think the elephant's gray and wrinkly and has a long
Yes.
nose. Yeah,
Yes.
it's easier to address it when it's at that lower level than waiting.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a bit about conflict and, you know, what's the reality. So, you know, off the top of your head, Courtney, how do you think conflicts actually get started?
Mm. I think if someone makes an observation of someone else and they have like a different opinion about what was going on there and what that either that person's values were or kind of what their actions were in that moment. But then if you kind of hold it in and ruminate over that and then develop stories about what's going on and why that happened, that's how it can get that bigger explosion.
Yeah, I think a lot of times conflicts explode because of communication. It might be what you communicated, the topic and the content,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of times I think it's the manner in which you communicated it. Like sometimes
Yes.
we're joking and we're being snarky, but the other person doesn't realize that. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you may say something and all of a sudden they're like, what are you talking about? But they don't tell you or they don't respond with what? So that you say, oh, I was just joking. And sometimes our jokes really are meant subconsciously, kind of those back of the head thoughts as digs, and we didn't realize it just leaked out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, communication can often be one of the roots of how things evolve.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how it escalates?
Um, Escalating. I really like this quote. It's like seek to understand, not to be understood. So I think if both people are kind of just trying to get their point across and they're not like listening or looking for where the other person is coming from, then that can just escalate and make it bigger, where you're both just trying to be understood instead of understanding the other person.
Yeah. When we think of, so we've been, you know, a lot of our examples so far have been individual to individual, but let's think about student organizations that maybe want to do a similar event, or maybe there's 4 project groups in your class and, you know, 2 committees or 2 small groups want the exact same topic. I think sometimes we don't stop as groups to say, why are you interested in that? So seeking information,
Mm.
or as you said, we jump on it, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes I think that happens because we're not listening, as you shared, and it happens individually and on the group level.
Mm.
So when you think back to your days as an undergrad or even here at CU Denver, what kind of conflicts do you think you've dealt with as a student leader?
Yeah, I was in a sorority in my undergrad, for those I have not told that to. And so I was the president of my organization, and we definitely had conflicts. So different conflicts that have happened at that time is um, if there's an expectation, for example, dues need to be paid in order for you to be able to go to this event. But that person was not able to pay their dues, but they weren't communicative about it. And then it came to the day of the event, and based on policy and process, they weren't able to go, but it became a whole big conflict because they wanted to really like explain why they thought from their perspective, kind of appeal the process and appeal that decision. But because there was no communication from early on, there wasn't enough time to like have that conversation to appeal it. It just was what the policy was in that moment. So everything's coming down to communication.
I know that when I think back to my days as a student leader, I was an RA. I was also a peer mentor, and I did presentations on campus. And I remember in both those settings, if one person wanted a responsibility and somebody else did, sometimes I saw conflict happen because somebody wouldn't share. And so it was a control thing. It was like,
Mm.
no, I want to be the leader of this effort, or no, I'll plan that program. And it really was about trusting the other people in the group. And it wasn't really about the other group members' talents or skills. It was like, no, I can do it better, you know, and so I'm just not going to share. And so then conflict would start. And sometimes I'd see an entire group that I was part of be against the leader. And I always thought that was sad. And so I always want students to stop and think, if I feel the need to control it and be in charge of it, to think inside why, so that we don't get to the point where there's conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to our fourth question. How do emotions affect you when you're discussing conflict?
Ooh. I think there's so many emotions that can come into play during conflict. Um, do do they understand where I'm coming from? Like wanting to be understood. Will what I'm trying to say or convey come across a certain way? Do I want, like, maybe I have an agenda or something that I'm really passionate about, and I'm not paying attention to that other person's emotions in that because I'm just focused on what my passion and my process for that. So I think there's a lot of different emotions that can happen. Also being embarrassed or wanting to shy away from the conversation or the conflict, and then kind of avoiding it all completely. So all the different emotions can really affect the conflict for sure.
Yeah. I know there are a lot of us that grew up in different types of homes. And so I've always told people that I'm from a house of yellers. So if my sister and I were fighting about something as children, like we would yell at each other, and sometimes we'd be in different rooms yelling. Eventually, my mother would walk in and be like, "You two need to stop. You need to get in the same room and you need to talk about this." And she would force us to do that. Like, she would only let that yelling go on so long. Other people, they grew up in households where no parent intervened. They grew up in households where just yelling happened, or they grew up in households where conflict was never talked about.
Mm-hmm.
It was ignored. That's right, shoved under the carpet. And so there's a continuum there of, you deal with it or you don't. And so I think we carry that with us throughout our lives. So a lot of student leaders come to campus and now they're not at home anymore. They're in a new environment. They might be living on or off campus. And they're learning how to be responsible for their own conflicts. And it's perfectly okay when you have a conflict to talk to a friend. I think it's important to talk through the emotions,
Yeah.
if possible, once you realize what you're feeling before you get there. Courtney and I also did a workshop on listening skills for leaders, so we'd encourage you to check that out. There's some tips in there that might help you when you think about emotions, because there's 4 categories: mad, sad, glad, or scared. And so sometimes I think conflict can definitely fall in the mad, the scared, or the sad. And so dealing with those emotions first might make addressing the conflict easier. So Courtney, because you work with our student organizations on campus, what do you think we can do as student organizations to prevent conflict within groups?
Yeah. I think one thing that a leader can do, and a leader is anyone, it does not need to be just a positional person, but a leader can role model how to deal with conflict. And instead of shying away from it, being able to have conflict with civility and respect in a conversation. So I think if we role model and also call it out in the open that we welcome conflict and that conflict is inevitable, and kind of have a conversation as a group about what we're going to do or what actions we can take when conflict does arise, I think is really helpful. It's more like preventative rather than reactive. I think also those like expectations, if you have certain expectations of your members or of your committees, or of people in executive positions, making sure those expectations are laid out and that there's a conversation before expectations are not being met, as opposed to just after the fact.
I think those are great tips. In fact, it made me think of something I've done as a supervisor of a group. I've given out a worksheet and asked people to tell me, how do you like to be recognized? And how do you want me to address you if there's a conflict and I need to talk to you about something? And I think that's absolutely something a student organization president can do at the beginning of the year with their executive board. Like, how do you want me to say good job? Because some people don't like to be recognized in front of groups. That embarrasses them. Whereas others are like, sure. Others would just have have an email. Thanks, you did a great job. Same thing with conflict. We want to know, like, would you rather I talk to you one-on-one immediately? Would you rather I email you to say, hey, I need to talk to you about last week's, organization meeting? Or would you rather I address you immediately afterwards? And so there's different feelings for people about the timing of a conflict being brought to their attention. Okay, so I would love to share with you something that I think is a legit thing. So for some people, something happens, and for them, it's just an event. It's just something that happened. Whereas for somebody else, this is a topic we need to talk about. And then for the third, it's like, no, this is an issue. So, let's think about somebody like your roommate. Let's say that your roommate is, 15 minutes late all the time. At first it's just an event. Oh, that's just so-and-so. They're always 15 minutes late. So maybe you adjust the time you tell them to show up, or you just know I'm going to have to wait. But after a while, it really starts to get on your nerves. And so now it's a topic and you have to choose, am I going to address this conflict, especially if you're a person in our example who is always on time or maybe 5 minutes early. So now it's a topic, and do I need to do something about it? And then if you let it go on and again, just like our volcano graphic, is it really become an issue? And so you have to kind of figure out, is it an event and I just want to comment about it? Is it a topic and I need to formalize it? Or is it an issue and I really need to address it so that our relationship isn't harmed? Does that sound familiar to like life experience for you?
Very much so, both personal and organizational. I'm thinking of a lot of different examples.
Yeah. So there are some common causes of conflict. Values differences, lifestyle differences, different goals. Sometimes it's just that interpersonal communication breakdown that we've talked about earlier. And sometimes it's a lack of intercultural competence. Like you don't know about other identities than your own and you haven't taken the time to ask. I will tell you, I think the number one of these 5 that I've experienced when working with students has been values difference. So a value is a tightly held belief that you act upon by choice. It means you think this thing is so important. Nobody tells you, in my earlier example, to value time. It is just your value. I will be there 5 minutes early. But somebody else may value, finishing tasks. And so, yeah, they show up a few minutes late because that task, I valued that more and know that, you'll be fine waiting for me for 5 minutes. And so it's a values difference. I think the second most common one has been that last one, that lack of intercultural competence. Part of being in college is really learning to listen to others, find out about others' identities, kind of acknowledge what are my identities and how do they impact people. One of my identities may communicate differently than your identity. And being able to go, oh, that's interesting. That's not how I think. Tell me more about that. Instead of saying, you're wrong. And then we have the root of a conflict. So there are 6 ways to deal with conflict. The first one is withdrawal and avoidance. This is where you might say, I don't want to talk about it, and you just kind of walk away. You might look at the person and go, fine, whatever. And again, you withdraw from the conversation. Or you go, I can't talk about that right now. Can we talk about that later? I just can't right now. And you kind of skitter away, right? You avoid it. Second time is indifference. Like you really just tune out and you're like, I just really don't care. Decide whatever. I'll do whatever. And again, I think indifference is kind of a subcategory of avoidance. And then the next one is compromising. Sometimes our way of dealing with conflict is, I'll give this up if you give this up, and then we'll meet in the middle, right? So then the next 3 are win-lose. So win-lose is a concept of I'm right, you're wrong, and one of us is going to come out the victor in this conflict. And so I'm right, you're going to do it my way or else, right? The next one is arbitration. And this is an interesting concept. We hear about this a lot in legal terms. It's a term we'll hear where there's somebody that's in the middle, usually a neutral party. And so the 2 sides of the conflict will come and share what's going on. So let's say that 2 clubs come to you, Courtney, and they say, we both want this meeting space in the Tivoli Student Union for our event on the same date and the same time. You decide as the arbitrator who gets the room. And so you'll get to hear both sides of their story, but you make the decision. So often with arbitration, it's fine, let someone else decide. Or if she agrees, I could be wrong. Like you decide that that person has more knowledge or more power to make the decision. The last one is similar, but I think more positive. It's still a neutral third party, and that's a mediator. And so you go to mediation and both sides tell their side of the issue of the conflict. But then the mediator, you in this role, Courtney, would ask them lots of questions and you would help them start to listen to each other. And often a really good mediator won't let them look at them. I'll say when I'm in a mediation situation, why don't you look right at this person and tell them what you're thinking? Because what students will tend to do is default to looking at us.
Yes.
Right? But we want to teach them those good communication skills. And so, they might tell you something and you go, hey, will you turn to so-and-so and say that to them? Let's see, let's have that, eye-to-eye communication. Okay. So there are 3 types of reactions to conflict. So most people are either passive, some people are assertive, and some people are aggressive. And our goal is always to kind of be in that middle, to be assertive. Because when you look at these words, if you're passive, you allow other people to step on your rights. If you're aggressive on the other side, sometimes you're stepping on other people because it's my way or the highway, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you're assertive, you're kind of in that middle and you're trying to protect both sides of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually this really, there's this really great chart that I like that shows the type of behavior. What does it mean to be passive with that type of behavior? Assertive and aggressive. So students, we'd actually like you to pause the video and read this chart. So Courtney, as we're talking about this, does anything pop out for you from this chart?
Let's see. I think the passive piece, I'm attracted to that because I know that I can fall into that at times. But the feelings when you engage in that behavior is like hurt or anxious at the time of confrontation, and then possibly angry later on at yourself for not saying anything in the moment. I can really resonate with that. And I think it's really important for us people who tend to be more passive to make sure that we are speaking up for ourselves in the moment, so that I know we've all experienced that, angry at ourselves later. And it's also better for the relationship, better for the other student that you're dealing with, better for if it's your advisor, or if it's a member of your organization or someone in your group class and your group assignment. It's better for us all if we kind of address it in that moment so that we're not angry at ourselves later on, and also maybe building up anger towards the other person because we did not express it and now we feel like it's too late. So us passive people, we've got to make sure that we're calling it out when we need to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. I really like the row that it says your feelings when you engage in the behavior. It's always good for me to remember if somebody's being passive, could they feel hurt? Do they feel anxious? Is my technique in approaching them, making that worse? When you look at aggressive on the feelings, sometimes people feel like they're so right, they're superior. But could they feel guilty about that later? Do they treat me differently if they were aggressive with me? And so how do I manage that? And so students, as you look at this chart, that gray column under or going down assertive, that is your goal. You want to be direct, you want to be expressive, but you want to set an even level. So that means, if you go back to our listening skills workshop, you're not standing over somebody when you confront them, you're on the same level with them. Maybe you're in a neutral location, not a place where one person has more power than the other. And so we want to, be confident in what we have to say, but also be respectful at the same time. We want to remember what our values are and maybe stop and pause in the conflict and say to the other person, what is the value that you're trying to protect? Tell me more about what's important to you. That in itself, if you ask that type of question, is being respectful. And so your goal is to be assertive. So we have a conflict styles default to be, very simple about it. Everyone has a default way of dealing with conflict. That way, your knee-jerk reaction, it kind of colors how you address conflict. Dealing with conflict is very learnable. And so what we would like to do is review kind of what these 5 types are. So the first one is collaborating. And so the collaboration style is known as the OWL style. This is when you kind of assert your views, you say your piece, but you also say, I'd like to now hear from you. What do you think of the situation? So you're open to differences. You want to make sure after you've had a conversation about the conflict, you kind of identify all the main concerns. So if there's 3 problems, you reiterate, okay, what I heard was, situation A, B, and C. And so you look for options, you'll brainstorm with the person you're working with, and you look for solutions. Ultimately, you try to find a solution to the problem that everybody agrees on. So that's collaborating, the OWL style. The next one is the compromising style. So this is known as the Fox. So here you don't want people to get really riled up and really, upset. And so you want to use moderation, and you urge moderation. You kind of start the bargaining process like, well, could we solve this problem if I do this and you do this? So you're trying to split the difference. And you're really trying to meet people halfway and find a way where everyone can have a little bit of faith that what's going on will work for them. So that's the fox. So the third style is called accommodating. This is the teddy bear. And this is kind of more on the passive side when we look at it, because you will accept the other person's view. You might not speak up and actually share what your view is, because you're just going to accept theirs. You'll let their view prevail. Sometimes you actually will give in because conflict is uncomfortable. Or you just decide, you know, I'm not really that invested in this. It's not a big deal. And if it's that important to that person, I'm going to let them decide what we'll do. Sometimes the other person will come up with a couple of ideas and you just support whichever one they're interested in. And if you've made an error, you will absolutely acknowledge that. So you accommodate the conflict situation. Fourth area is known as the turtle. And so this is the avoiding or withdrawing. And so this is the person who may be highly uncomfortable with conflict. Again, may not have been brought up where they learned how to deal with conflict at home or in school before they got to college. And so they may delay dealing with conflict or avoid responding. Sometimes it's not about being uncomfortable. Sometimes avoiding withdrawing is actually a really great technique if you need to research and find out more information before you come to the table. So I don't want to communicate that avoiding or withdrawing is a bad thing to do. Sometimes it's the right strategy.
Or if you want to let your emotions out beforehand.
Yes, you can be more calm at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So you may withdraw or be inaccessible because, again, you could be strategizing. You could just be too anxious to deal with it. You may not have the skill to deal with it, or you want to figure out how to be calm when you come to it. So you may divert attention. So that is the avoiding and withdrawing. And then the last one is known as the shark style. This is the forcing or competing. So sometimes you want to control the outcome. Sometimes there's a power struggle. Sometimes it's like, nope, my agenda is more important than yours. I often tell student leaders there is a time and place to be forcing or competing. I worked with resident advisors in residence halls for years, and I said, what style do you think you should use when there's a fire alarm? Absolutely, you're going to use the forcing and competing, and that is the right time. No matter what kind of conflict it causes, you're there for life safety, right? So sometimes we make choices as leaders on how we manage a conflict. Conflict could be, I'm studying, I don't want to leave my room. Hey, fire alarm's going off. There really could be one. I do need you to go. In a interpersonal conflict, though, a person who's forcing or competing could discourage disagreement or really insist on, no, my view is the right view. So time and place for all of these. So this is kind of how the 5 styles fall out, and they're based on the Thomas Kilmann model. I'm curious, and I can go back to a slide if I need to, Courtney. We know that the avoiding and competing styles are on a continuum about being assertive or less assertive. Mm-hmm. And the avoiding and accommodating styles are on a continuum about how cooperative you are or not. And our compromising is kind of smack in the middle. Can you think of, and we don't have to do all 5, but can you think of any student organization examples where you might use one of these styles with a conflict?
Okay. Let me think. For the collaborating piece, if we want to work with another organization, and so that means we both have different missions, reasons for existing, and say we potentially want to collaborate and work together. That is an incredible time to use that method where you are really seeking what the other person is looking for and what the other group is looking for. So that one of your organizations aren't being overly assertive, and that you're making sure that both organizations have a stake in the program, that they both are interested in it and feel like they're empowered and that it's part of theirs. Because then so many things can happen afterwards if they don't feel like they have been properly collaborated with, including not participating as much or not providing as many ideas, because they were using maybe their shark techniques and they weren't really interested or looking for that collaborative approach.
I think that's an excellent example. I've seen 2 or 3 groups come together to try to do one big fundraiser on campus. Mm-hmm. But again, there's different styles, and when ideas are generated, and one group may really love one idea, one group loves another, and then it's almost like, okay, are they going to split and do separate fundraisers, or are they going to work through it and use the right conflict management style to make it more of a creativity result from conflict versus personal, oh, you won't do our idea, so we hate you as a group, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's positives and negatives about each one of these styles. It's important as a student leader for you to really think and reflect on when's the appropriate time to use this style, and when do I need to push myself to be more cooperative or more assertive based on the values that I'm trying to represent in the conflict.
Yeah.
So at this point in time, we would love for you all to take the conflict styles inventory. So if you will pause the video, we want you to look down underneath the YouTube video in the description. In that description, you'll find a link where you can download a conflict management styles inventory. And we'd actually like you to take that and then restart the video. Okay, so Courtney, hopefully folks have taken the inventory. I know I had you take it earlier. So this was kind of your knee-jerk reaction of which of those 5 styles. So what do your results say about you? What would you like to share with us?
Well, I had a tie in 3 areas and then another tie in 2 areas. So collaborating, accommodating, and compromising were all a tie. And then competing and avoiding at 7 rather than 10 were a tie. But I wasn't surprised at all when I took this. I think what my results say about me is that I can be kind of like a chameleon in a way, and it depends on kind of the situation and what's going on, and I utilize a lot of different methods depending on the situation, which is interesting, and it doesn't really surprise me because as I'm reading each of them, I'm like, oh, I've done that one in this scenario and that one in this scenario. Something that I think was interesting is that I kept popping back and forth from either school, work, or personal life. And I think if I focused in one area, I may have found a more like stronger.
Got it.
Yep, sway.
I know one of my lowest rated ones is the competition. I am turned off by competition. I get conflict and that we have different ideas. I'd much rather try and collaborate or compromise, but collaboration is kind of my top one. But if you want to be competitive, I'm done. Like, it just really demotivates me. I don't need to compete with other people. And I don't know where that comes from, but I know that about myself in conflict. If it's competition for you, I'm done.
Yeah, competition's really low for me too. And while I love competition in play, in work or collaborative situations, I shut down as well.
Yeah, you're right. There's a difference when you're playing in your personal life versus at work or in a group that you really care about.
Yeah.
So our second question is, what does this mean as far as dealing with conflict as a leader when you think about your style? So maybe pick one of those 3 that were tied at the top, and what does that style mean to you as far as dealing with conflict?
I'm going to choose accommodating as the one that I'm going to focus on for that question. But I think what that can mean a lot of times is that my voice may be lost in a scenario where I can be overly accommodating, and while that can make me very likable, and maybe that makes the conflict actually go by quicker, or we don't end up having the conflict because I'm being accommodating. In the longer run, maybe I feel like my voice and my perspective is not being heard.
Got it. Okay. So what can you do with this information now that you know your styles?
Ooh. What I think is so interesting about this conflict management inventory is that I would love to know the other styles of people on my team. I think it's important for me to know where kind of my strengths and weaknesses lie, and what the positive effects and negative effects are of my accommodating style, for example. But what makes me excited about these inventories is when I can know the styles of other people on my team, so that I can learn to understand them more and kind of look for or know what they're looking for when conflict arises.
That is great that you said that. So I will share with our students from CU Denver who are watching, you know, we're happy as student life staff members to do this workshop with your club or organization. And I think this is a great staff development, especially at the beginning of the school year. So in August, September, this would be a great instrument to take in a brief workshop to complete, just to be prepared for how are we going to manage conflict, because it'll happen.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So my last question is, what do you need to do to feel more comfortable when dealing with conflict?
The one thing I really learned from today was the emotions piece, and maybe getting those out in a more constructive way rather than right in the moment in the conversation. Maybe calling a friend and just kind of venting everything out to them so that you can just express the emotions, so that when you're in, maybe right before the conversation, you do that and then take a breather. And then when you are ready and calm and feel like you can actually receive and have a conversation, that's the best time to do that. So the emotions was a big thing I learned today.
Cool. You know, I often tell folks as a leader, if you need to come in my office or we need to go get coffee or go out to lunch, proverbially, we're closing the door. You are welcome to verbally vomit, to get all that emotion out. So then you can take a deep breath, and as a leader as well, you can go, okay, now that I've dealt with the emotions, it's out of my body, I've spoken out loud, now how do I want to manage this conflict or this problem?
And that kind of goes back to that accommodating style. Like, what do I need to do with my emotions with the accommodating piece? With the accommodating piece, I usually want to make sure other people are feeling good. I don't want to provide conflict for them, and I want to kind of please them in a people pleaser type way. I want their ideas to be heard and a part of the situation. But what I can do in that moment is, instead of just thinking like, hey, removing my voice from this would allow this to actually, for them to, their thoughts and process to be heard. I can deal with the emotions that sharing my ideas does not necessarily mean that theirs will not be heard.
Thank you. That was really astute. So Courtney, let's talk about how do I confront? So here's my 3 tips for you. Do it in private if possible, in the group if appropriate. And so that's kind of tricky. Sometimes I've stopped a meeting as the meeting leader and said, hey, let's take a 5-minute break. How about everybody go grab a soda, grab a coffee, we'll come back together in a few minutes. And then I might say, hey, Susie, can I talk to you? You know, or I might walk to the restroom with them or walk down, to the coffee shop with them and be like, hey, and try to address the conflict in private. Or I might do it after a meeting. Sometimes in a group, if somebody's being really, let's say, shark style, aggressive, I might say, hey, I would like for us to stop. Let's all take a deep breath. I'd like for you to be a better listener, whatever the right phrase is at that time. The other thing is to remember the 3 R's. So respect, responsibility, and rights. Everybody deserves respect. And at the same time, you have a responsibility to speak your piece, but you need to respect their right to speak their piece. So it's kind of a balance. And then the last thing is you use I statements. And I statements are really simple to use and really effective. So basically it's a formula. When blank happens, I feel blank, I would like for you to blank. Okay, so you're taking ownership of your feelings. You're not saying, when you are late for dinner, you make me mad, you need to be on time. That's gonna make you defensive, right? Exactly. But if I say, when you're 15 minutes late, I feel concerned and worried, or I feel frustrated because I have to get back to my room to study, I would really like it if you could text me when you think you're going to be more than 5 minutes late. So it's taking it on yourself. And so here are some quick examples. So here's one that happens a lot, especially with flaming extroverts. If somebody's a real talkative person, they might interrupt a lot. And so that could be uncomfortable. And if you want to confront that, instead of saying, why do you always have to interrupt? Instead, you might say, hey, when you try to talk to me while I'm talking, it's really hard for me to pay attention because I'm thinking about something else. I'm thinking about what I'm talking about. I'd really appreciate it if you could wait until I'm finished, and then I will happily listen to what you have to say, unless you think it's really urgent that you have to interrupt me right at that moment. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, there was a big tone change, and I felt more like I should listen to your concerns in the second one. And the first one, I was like, ah.
Exactly. Here's the second one. You don't respect me. You never remember my birthday. Instead, what if you said, when you forget my birthday, I feel like you don't care about me as a friend, and I would like to feel that you care about me. So I hope you'll remember my birthday next year. Yeah, so very different. you're so annoying with all the questions you're asking. Oh my gosh, stop asking questions. Instead, you might say, you know, when you ask me questions while I'm doing something else, I feel really distracted and irritated because I'm not ready to pay attention. It would be really nice, and I'd appreciate it if you could ask those questions at a more convenient time. Could we like talk like in maybe an hour when I'm done studying? You know, whatever it is. And again, this is kind of formal language on these slides. Put it in your speak. You know, simplify it so it makes sense for you.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of at the end of our workshop, and we really want to make sure that we share with students, how do you hold a crucial conversation? CU Denver actually has some really stellar long workshops that Human Resources does, and I do think that they do them for students periodically about how to hold a crucial conversation. Courtney, have you ever heard that phrase before, crucial conversation?
Yes, I have. And this triangle is what I think of right when I think of crucial conversations, that strong emotions piece and the high stakes and opposing viewpoints.
Yeah, have you been through formal training on this?
Yeah, I actually participated in the HR program probably almost 3 years ago at this point. And that was a wonderful program. They provide a lot of tips and tricks and have you both look at it personally and professionally. It really changed the perspective I have and the way that I strategize in crucial conversations.
That's awesome. So students, we really want you to think about, there's 3 parts to having a crucial conversation. So sometimes there's opposing opinions, people have strong emotions, and maybe there's high stakes, like everybody's invested in something. So Courtney, if you don't mind if I put you on the spot,
Yeah.
and through the formal training, would you kind of review for us the 6 steps?
Do it. Okay, step number 1 being get your mindset right. Remind you of the emotions talk earlier? Before you even start the conversation, you need to identify where you're stuck. Make sure you focus on the right issue by considering the following. What is the outcome you want from the conversation for yourself, for the relationship, and potentially for the team or organization? I think that's so important. So it's like, what is the goal of your conversation? Are you trying to be heard? Are you trying to just get your feelings heard and make sure that other person knows that they're wrong in that situation? Or are you trying to like build your connection and really have the relationship flourish more? Just reset by thinking what your goal of the conversation is. Next, make it safe. The first 30 seconds are likely to determine the outcome of your conversation. Create an environment where you both feel comfortable to discuss the issue openly and honestly without feeling under attack. There's that emotions piece to making sure you're getting those expelled before coming back in. And sharing your concerns in a non-threatening way. Avoid controversy by leading with observations and facts rather than your interpretation of what you observed. Then, tentatively share your feelings, thoughts, and assumptions. And that's like those I statements that Tirza was talking about, where you were really coming at from like, hey, it's really annoying when you ask me all those questions. But if you just kind of focus on the facts of what the other person is doing and share how it makes you feel, then it puts it on you instead of kind of threatening and going at the other person. Asking for input. Ask the other person if they have a different view to you. The only limit to how strongly you express your own opinion should be your willingness to equally encourage others to challenge it. I love that. So when you have that I statement from earlier, like, hey, I noticed this, it made me feel, or it made me think, it made me concerned, this, what is your perspective of it? So you're kind of opening what they call it in the Crucial Conversation series is the pool of dialogue. So you're trying to lead everyone to that pool so that you can all kind of swim in there and have that dialogue together. So number 5, working towards a mutual purpose. You don't have to be best friends with someone to respect them and work towards a common goal. Think back to step number 1 of what your goal is in the conversation. You may need to share with them what you want for the relationship to build a mutual purpose and create new strategies to achieve it. So that goes back to number 1 is you want to make sure that you both are having the same goal in the conversation. So for example, you can say, hey, like, you can call it out and be like, hey, I want our relationship to be strengthened after this, or I want this process to be streamlined so it's easier for the user on the end. So just making sure that that goal is called out and you're conversating about that. Then finally, deciding on a plan of action. So how you end the conversation is just as important as how you start. Without deciding on next steps, the conversation becomes meaningless. What will change as a result of speaking directly to your colleague about the problem? If we just leave all the good, amazing work that was done in that conversation in that room, and we don't bring it with us or kind of make action steps, like let's say we were having a conflict and with another student member, and you were having a personal conflict where you had some different values that were rubbing, and that was getting in the way of you doing your work for the organization, then this is a perfect way for it. Let's talk about, okay, let's have a plan of action. What are we going to do to make sure we're strengthening our relationship so that our work can be done?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think one of the most important steps in this whole kind of setting up and holding a crucial conversation is that making it safe.
Yes.
And sometimes I know when I've had to have difficult conversations, I start with telling that person that I care about them. I have something difficult to talk to them about. I want to know their thoughts and opinions. I want them to feel comfortable. If anytime they don't feel comfortable, we can pause and we can pick the conversation up later. And I want to make sure that they are ready for that conversation, and then I'll dive in.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So folks, that ends our workshop on conflict management today. This has been an introduction. There are lots more nuanced and deeper levels that you can learn about with conflict management, and we encourage you to do that. There's lots of great books out there to read. If you would like to get credit for this workshop as a leadership workshop for the Lunch and Lead series, again, if you'll look in the description box underneath this YouTube video, follow the link to our Google form, fill it out, and we'll verify your attendance. And I will share with you several of the reflection questions that I asked Courtney, and we will actually ask you to respond to. And we want to thank you for watching, and have a good rest of the semester.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.